What's up, everybody? It is week 8, at the halfway point of our Tell Me Something Good series looking at the Old Testament. I'm excited about this, but I'm also excited because my St. Louis Cardinals won their division, start their playoff run on Friday, and my family's going to get to go to a playoff game. We've never done that, so that's very cool, very exciting. It's been a fun year, but I'm more excited about what I get to do with my youth ministry every week, and so this week, we're talking about Joseph. We're talking about his life, and it's a broad number of passages, rather. And so we're just going to be able to kind of hit it on an overview level and talk about some important stuff with him. And look at how through Joseph's story, we can see that God is in control, even through all of life's twists and turns, that he's sovereign, he's in control, he's got it all under his wings. So we're going to start with looking at who is Joseph. He was one of Jacob's youngest sons. In Genesis 30, 22 through 24, it says that God had favor finally on Rachel and opened her womb. And it says specifically, God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add another son to me. And we know that he did. He gave her Benjamin later as well. His name means the Lord adds, Joseph's does. He was the 11th son of Jacob, but the first with Rachel, the wife Jacob loved, the wife that he had not been able to have a child with yet. The wife that was jealous of Leah, her sister, and the sons that she bore. And God finally gave them favor, opening her womb with Joseph and Benjamin. The second thing about Joseph is that he was daddy's favorite. It says in chapter 37, Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. These are the family records of Jacob. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. The young man was working with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought a bad report about them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than his other sons because Joseph was a son born to him in his old age, and he made a robe of many colors for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not bring themselves to speak peaceably to him. So Joseph and Benjamin were special to Jacob because of which wife they were born to, who their mother was, because they were born late in his life. In fact, it says that Joseph was his favorite because he was his son born in his old age. So he showed him favoritism. He had this special robe made for him, gave it to him, which is bad parenting, by the way, just kind of as a side note. But he gave him this special robe, and it upset his brothers. Joseph was probably a little bit of a tattletale, stayed out of mischief and tattled on his brother and kind of the informant of the family. So he was daddy's favorite. He was also cocky. It says later in chapter 37, he had a dream. When he told his brothers they hated him even more, he said, listen to this dream. There we were, binding sheaves of grain in the field. Suddenly my sheaf stood up, and your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Are you really going to reign over us, his brothers asked? Are you really going to rule us? So they hated him, and hated him even more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another one where the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed down, including his mother and father, ultimately, is the interpretation there. So he had these dreams, but he was dumb. He was naive to tell his brothers of his dreams. In these dreams, they all bowed down to him. And later that happened. Later we see that was vindicated later down the line in the story. But it's probably better left untold. So he's kind of cocky. He's kind of naive. It only intensified their hatred for him as the favorite child, as the chosen son, if you will. So what did they do? Well, they didn't like him. They plotted against him. It's kind of a tale of sordid situations is how I kind of worded it here. They sold him into slavery. Later in chapter 37, it says their contempt grew for him. It says that they plotted his death, but they were ultimately talked out of murdering him and sold him into slavery instead. And so he wound up a slave, wound up in Potiphar's home. Potiphar was the captain of the guard for the king, and he was a bigwig, and Joseph became very important within Potiphar's house, and Potiphar was very important within the kingdom. So he's in Potiphar's house. He was bought from the Ishmaelites by Potiphar. It says the Lord was with Joseph. He became a successful man serving his master and so forth. He was made in charge of a lot of different things. But his master's wife, Mrs. Potiphar, if you will, she tried to seduce him. Joseph was good looking. He was handsome. He was important. He was a good worker. He's prosperous, successful. God blessed him. He moved up into this high position. And Potiphar's wife, who was lonely at home while Potiphar was off doing whatever, tried to seduce him time and time again. He resisted, but ultimately she was insulted, humiliated, angry, and she basically accused him of rape. Now, who are you going to believe, the slave or the high up, the important person's wife? Her word was taken, and Joseph was thrown into prison. Again, another setback. He's had setback after setback in his life that he's climbed out of. His master's wife falsely accused him. But he trusted God's plan and kept fighting his way back. God was with Joseph. Despite all the unfairness, despite all the things he had to fight through, God had a plan. God had a purpose through it all. Joseph trusted God. He never compromised his integrity or his beliefs. He was faithful to God always. Again, he rose through the ranks, climbing high up. He's still imprisoned. He's still a prisoner, but he's high up within the prison, in charge of a lot of things within the prison. But he was kind of forgotten by the cupbearer, who said he would remember him when he got out on the other side, until Pharaoh's dreams came about. Pharaoh had dreams, and Joseph ultimately was the only one who could interpret them. He was able to explain what the dreams meant, that there was going to be 7 years of good and 7 years of famine. He even suggested a plan, and because he had this plan, he was given the job of implementing it. He was released from prison, given this job of implementing it, given a high position. And because of that, his wisdom, his planning, his plan, a lot of lives in Egypt, a lot of lives beyond Egypt, and even his own families ultimately were saved because of it. So what can we learn from Joseph? What life lessons can we learn? First is this: we can't always control what happens, but we can always control how we respond. There are things that are just completely out of our control that happen to us. We can't control those things, but we can control our response to them. Joseph knew that God was with him through good and bad alike. He knew that he was never alone. He couldn't control what happened, but he could control the way he responded to what happened. We can always control our reactions and our responses to the things that happen in our lives. Think about it with kids. A lot of times one kid does something to the other. What does the other one do? Well, they jump all over him, and they seek revenge and all that kind of stuff. That's not the proper response, and it's a controllable response. We can't always control what happens, but we can control how we respond. Second thing, God's in control whatever life brings. At the end of Genesis in chapter 50, after Joseph has helped save his own family, his brothers are scared to death that dad's gone now and he's going to be after them and so forth. And Joseph's response to them, after tears and all this kind of stuff, Joseph's response to them is, don't be afraid. What you've intended for evil, God has intended for good. In the moment, we can't see God in control. We see things in the moment while God sees the bigger picture. Sometimes we can look back at some of the most difficult things in our lives, some of the hard things we face. We can see God's hand in shaping and molding us, but we don't like it at the time. God's in control through whatever life brings. And finally, what seems intended for harm, God can use for good. His brothers are begging to be spared. He tells them, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. Nobody enjoys the hardships. Nobody seeks struggles and hard times and difficulties and stuff like that. But in hindsight, we can see how God takes those tough things and uses them for good in our lives and in the lives of others. Joseph saw this in his life. He had hardship after hardship that turned ultimately into good. God's plans and purposes are greater than ours. They're better than ours. He has a plan even for the suffering, even for the difficult times. Joseph's story takes up about a quarter of the book of Genesis. It's from about chapter 37 to 50. There's other things woven in there, and he's mentioned slightly before that. But it's a significant part of the beginning of the Bible. And we can learn from his story. His efforts ultimately point people to Christ and to salvation. But it also shows that whatever happens, God is in control. Whatever happens, he can use it for our good. He can use it for the accomplishment of his plans and for his glory in the world. Whatever we face, we know that he can take it. He can take that thing. He can shape us, and he can accomplish his plans. He can accomplish his glory. He can bring amazing stuff as we cling to him and as we remember that he's in control over it all. So tonight, what do you need to give back to him? What do you need to trust him for in your life? Don't wait for that. Do it now. Don't wait. Let God be in control. Let him use whatever it is for his glory and for your good.